Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Next year marks 50 years since Papua New Guinea's independence. Many Australians might not realise that when PNG became independent, it was from Australia and not Britain like so many colonies of the 20th century. Joining me to discuss the history of PNG is Dr Brad Underhill. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Brad.
Thanks for inviting me on, Georgina.
So great to have you on, and apologies that we are doing this on Zoom rather than in person, even though you are a resident of Melbourne, but oh well.
All good. I'm in front of the heater. I'm happy.
Yes, I know. It's that time of year where heaters are a real priority. In preparing for this podcast, I felt terribly embarrassed about how little I knew about the territory that was once an Australian territory of Papua New Guinea, of course now very much an independent country, almost 50 years old. But tell me about PNG becoming a territory of Australia. Let's start at the beginning, which really is very linked to the time of federation, isn't it?
It is, yes. So it's not unusual that you didn't know that much about it. We ran a third-year unit, Deakin, for many years. The students there, we would ask them, what do you know about Papua New Guinea? And invariably it was Kokoda. That was what people pretty much knew about PNG. So PNG it was separate territories. We had Papua and we had New Guinea, and they were administered separately as well. But in 1884, Germany took the north of now Papua New Guinea, and Australia was in a complete panic at that stage, the colonies. So they hassled the British to say, come on down, please protect us. And so Papua became a British protectorate and then a colony until Federation. But the eastern colonies actually funded that colony as well. So at Federation, we got to the territory of Papua in 1905, and the idea then was that it would become a place where it was quite paternalistic, but also a very protective place. So there was very minimal development in Papua. Germany was still in control of New Guinea until First World War. And so you could not buy land in Papua. You could lease land, long-term leases, whereas in New Guinea, you could buy land, and it was far more of an economic model. And then when we got to World War I, the first fighting of World War I was actually up in Rabaul in New Guinea. And I think from memory, maybe 7 or 8 Australians were killed there. And so Australia took control in 1914. And then infamously, or maybe famously, I don't know, Prime Minister Billy Hughes at Versailles in 1919 argued very strongly that New Guinea was our natural birthright. So at that point, Australia took control. That was much to the chagrin of Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. He wasn't happy about that. But anyway, we took control and it became a mandated territory under the League of Nations. And it was our responsibility as Australians to protect and develop the peoples of New Guinea as well as the peoples of Papua. But they were run separately as separate colonies, I guess, for want of a better word, right up until 1942 when the Japanese invaded. And they had completely different emphasis. So we had this protective model in Papua. These were Australian citizens, for want of a better word. They were certainly Australian citizens. Papuans were Australian citizens from 1948 with the Citizenship Act, but British subjects before that. And New Guinea was run as a business, lots of gold mining, lots of plantations. Not that they weren't in the south, but they were far more in the north. So it's quite a difference. And then when we get this melding together in 1942, where they come under the control of the army, Angao, and at that point, we get this merging together. It's very much, obviously, they're defending. We've been invaded. It's Australian territory that we're being invaded. It's an important point to make here that this is an Australian territory that has been invaded. We have been invaded. It's not a foreign territory. And what we get is the melding together of two different attitudes. And that plays out in the post-war period with the different officers that were working in New Guinea compared to the officers who work in Papua. So, yeah, I guess that's a brief summary. So in terms
of the attitude towards economic development versus protection
and
sort of trusteeship. Tell me, Brad, though, I'm interested in Billy Hughes in that First World War era saying that this is our birthright.
Fascinating, isn't it?
That this territory is something that Australians expect to own, to occupy, to possess. Was that, do you think, linked to that sense of it being a kind of a buffer, defensive buffer between Australia and Asia? What was the thinking behind Billy Hughes' sentiments there?
Well, the buffer is definitely a very strong point in terms of the motivation, why we wanted to be there right from the start, and the reasoning behind maintaining those colonies, very limited, by the way. Just as a side point, New Guinea had to fund itself, and we spent £40,000 per year running Papua. There was almost nothing done. We could say we were a colonial power from Federation, but really we weren't. We did nothing up there. That as a side point, that's a side point. In terms of the attitude, I think you could say it almost stems back to Deakin, actually, Alfred Deakin, and this idea that we get this sort of Monroe doctrine like the United States have, that we won't have any, and it's playing out today, politics of today around China encroaching on us. So this is our region. It's as the white man, I guess. We might as well play it for what it is. We are expected to maintain a security buffer, yes, in one way, but also it's our area. We're in control of this area. So this is a white man's area. It's our responsibility. You could almost also think of it in terms of the white man's burden. It's the same type of time as Kipling's idea of it's our responsibility to lift up the native peoples, the Pacific Islanders. And I think that just kind of plays out a little bit right up till today. But that's how I interpret Hughes's trenchant belief that it was going to be Australian territory. And another thing to point out here too is that when we get to World War II and we have the Japanese invade, our military forces, the AAF, is in the Middle East. And so who have we got here in Australia to defend Australia? We have just the National Guard. So it's old blokes and young men. And so they send them up to New Guinea until our AAF gets back. Curtin famously has an argument with Churchill to say, no, we need these guys back. We turn our backs on the Brits and put our gaze and reliance on the United States. And it's those young men that are up there fighting in Kokoda until the AAF get back, because it is Australian territory. So we don't have compulsory military service until Vietnam overseas. This is compulsory national service that they're fighting up there as well. So
that's right. We had this sort of conscription during World War II, but it was just for the territories of Australia, limited. And of course, as you say, this included Papua New Guinea. And you raise an important point that, of course, the territory of Australia has been invaded through the invasion by the Japanese into Papua New Guinea. And, of course, the Kokoda Trail is still an iconic and tragic experience of Australian troops during World War II. And, of course, our Prime Minister and the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister walked a portion of that trail the other day.
Any step on that thing is hard work. So
I understand. I think my father might have done part of it, and he's certainly not the fittest person, but he's okay. Yes, a bit of a struggle, I understand. Tough. But, quite I think a really important experience for Australians to have, to realise how tough it was for the people who were fighting for our freedom. But that idea that it was a territory of Australia, but our remembering of that period of the connection with Papua New Guinea with the effluxion of time has dissipated, and that we don't identify that invasion as part of a threat to the territory of Australia. Why do you think that is, Brad?
Well, we've just at Deakin have written a special issue exactly on this self-publication. I guess that what we have focused on is the fact that Australia, when PNG became independent, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, but when it became independent, it kind of cleaved away any sort of national remembering of PNG as part of Australia, particularly Papua. And historians in Australia, and of course most people don't read historians' work, I understand that, but it does play out in intellectual circles and plays its way down into common language, I guess. And they focused on developing a national identity from the 1970s that had to incorporate Indigenous histories. So almost at the same time as these historians that had previously been working on PNG, there was a much more emphasis on considering the very important work of remembering the Aboriginal Australians. So our focus went in that direction, and also trying to re-identify ourselves away from Britain, because we had to find our place in Asia. Britain were focusing in on Europe. It was all in the mid-1970s, this new nationalism, which wasn't just playing out in Australia, it was playing up around the world, but many other, like Canada was going through the same sort of idea, what to do and how to remember these territories, as well as it's easier to think about, especially a place like Australia, your nation with that kind of logo map with little tail of Tasmania at the end. Once you start thinking about Papua New Guinea, it starts getting a bit confusing, especially when they're not part of it.
When you conceptualise our history, you conceive, obviously, the ancient history, Indigenous Australians, and then British coming in the 18th century. and colonisation. But then we don't necessarily think of Australia as a coloniser itself in terms of how we conceive of Australia and its history. And so this sort of idea that we would have occupied a territory, I mean, it wasn't necessarily against the will of the Papua and New Guinean people, but that was part of our story, I don't think fits the narrative that we tell ourselves, does it?
Doesn't. It is such an insightful comment, Georgina. So 2 ways to think about this. Firstly, just personally, I get asked, why did you do research into PNG? That's my interest in it. And I say, it was happenstance. However, it was also the fact that I was fascinated by the idea of us as a colonizer. You just think of us as a colony. So it's just really strange. It's really weird. So it captured my imagination. So once I started reading into it, what was interesting is that the people in Papua New Guinea, the Australians, the expatriates, they did not think of themselves as a colonizer. They honestly were up there thinking they were administering Australian territory. People like Rachel Cleland, who was the wife of the long-term administrator up there, she talked about the first time she heard the word colonise was 1965, and she'd been up there since 1952. And what we find very interesting is that as PNG gets closer to independence and Australia is trying to wash its hands in the 1960s of being a colony, they don't want to be associated with Rhodesia and all that sort of stuff, there is this change in language from territory to colony from the Australian government as much as anybody else. The push for independence is not really coming from PNG. It's coming from Australia, let it go. And so the language changes to a colony as much as anything. So it's still the territory of Papua and New Guinea until independence or until 1972. But the language and the way it's framed is a colony. It's reckoning there at that point. Just the language. Embarrassing to be a colonizer. We don't want to be a colonizer.
But tell me, Brad, what was the nature of Australian rule and administration of Papua New Guinea? Because it was different from, say, the British or the Germans or the Dutch, the Spanish going into a territory and taking it over and declaring this is our colony. It was more of a trusteeship, wasn't it?
Correct. Yeah. So when you think about PNG in terms of being a colony, it's very late to become a colony in comparison to most of the 18th and 19th century, and then primarily extractive colonies. The idea is to take the natural resources and produce stuff from it. So as Britain was doing, the French were doing, as you say, Dutch with oil and rubber, and Brits with Malaya and rubber, etc. Australia never did that. It was never about economic benefit to Australia. It cost Australia money, and very minimal prior to the Second World War because we kind of just ignored them. But after the Second World War, the amount of money that the Australian government were putting into PNG, I think it equated to something like over a 15-year period in today's dollars. Got it in my forthcoming book, but I can't remember the number, but it's around about $4 billion. Huge numbers at the time. Yeah, I mean, massive amounts of money were going in there.
And to this day, Brad, PNG is the largest recipient of Australian aid, so this certainly
it is, not... Yes, it's $500 million. $500 million at the moment, at a minimum, plus, of course, all the natural disasters and rugby
plus what
teams.
I was going to say, be putting into the new rugby team, the new NRL team, $640 million.
What is that? It's amazing.
We'll get onto that later. But so post-World War II, we're investing enormous amounts into our territory, PNG.
So what's important here is that when we decide to focus on PNG as our territory, as our colonies, as being responsible colonisers, it's in a period where even the British using a different attitude. It's more about what can we do for the local people. Attitudes are changing during the 1930s as under the guise of the Fabians. So they're an educated socialist mob, I suppose. They believe in Marxism to an extent, but non-revolutionary. And they are pushing the line of we need to be responsible colonisers. They're not necessarily anti-colonial. They would generally work within government circles. And so it emanates out of Britain. That's where Fabians emanate. But the Australian development in the 1940s is through an organisation, through the Army in the 1940s. It's a Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs, and they are all academics and they're all Fabians. They really believe in this idea of, as you mentioned, the word trusteeship, social trusteeship, and that is where we must develop systems to protect, but also develop, I use that in quotation marks, develop the primitive peoples of Papua New Guinea so that they can stand on their own 2 feet. It's an attitude that comes from government and also comes from The other of the Australian government that's very active at this time, and that's external affairs under Evatt, and there's a very important player that is his advisor at the UN. So just to take a step back, so we've got the 1945, Australia's very active in developing the UN Trusteeship Council, and they're really trying to keep on the good graces of the Americans who are anti-colonial. And that is that if we're going to have colonies, the United Nations are going to have a monitoring system. And so this monitoring, so that you every year, you would have to write a report to say what you've been doing to develop your colonies, and everybody's involved in it. The Brits are really unhappy about it. There's a real break between the Australians and the Brits over this issue. And so the External Affairs Department, under the helm of Evatt, has an advisor on that called Paul Haslock, who's one of our advisors, who is the most important person in Papua New Guinea history, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. But it is liberal internationalism. So we've got the UN, we've got the Atlantic Charter. It is this idea we are social. We've got a responsibility to society. We've got a responsibility to everybody in the world, not just ourselves. It's not about nationalism anymore. We are international citizens, and we've got these core beliefs of liberalism, which is protection of the rights of the individual. And then we get into this messy bit about how much government should be involved. We can talk about that. But that is the motivations, those two key pillars. What's going on with DORCA, the Research Council within the Army, with these academics, and what's going on within the external affairs peoples, and how they are melding together to come up with this idea of how we're going to develop PNG in the future, with an eventual very, very long-term goal of them becoming independent as a developed people.
Yeah, but our commitment was that one day it would be independent of Australia. Yes. So there wasn't a sense in that post-World War II period that this would be a forever territory and another state of Australia. This was going to be something we took responsibility for. It's been our territory. These are our Australian citizens, but eventually they will perform an act of self-determination and declare their own sovereignty and own state, and we will support them on that journey.
Yes, you're right. A little bit more complicated that in one sense. So part of the motivation here is that we've got this debt of gratitude to the Papua New Guineans, the fuzzy wuzzy, famous fuzzy wuzzy sort of symbol. So in 1945, the Australian government sets out, it's under Chifley, they said this is the New Deal for Papua New Guinea. It's bipartisan. And in fact, this is a bipartisan project right up until Whitlam becomes the opposition leader in the 1960s. And the idea here is that we will be responsible for these people and they will get their independence in the long term, but there's never a date.
And using, Brad, this terminology, is that modelling off US New Deal? Is that the...
Yes, correct. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so hopefully we'll talk about that in a minute, about the liberal response, the extreme centre of liberalism. But it's important to point out here that there is never any end point here on when they are going to get their independence. They are thought of as being so prehistoric that it's just like it's an end game. And also, just as an aside, in this special issue that I spoke about in Australian Historical Studies, myself and my colleague Helen Gardner have written an article about a very strong chance in the 1960s of PNG becoming a state, the seventh state of Australia. A whole load of Papua New Guinean politicians came down to Canberra, met with Holt, met with all number of different politicians down here. There was a really strong movement to make it part of Australia. And there was a poll, a Gallup poll at that time, and 30% of Australians said yes, PNG should become a territory, should become the seventh state of Australia. It's never going to happen, of course. And they got whitewashed, it was white Australia. But there was a general move and a push within PNG and a lot of sympathy in parts of Australian society for it to become a state of Australia. So, yes, on the one hand, Australia is saying we're going to develop, but on the other hand, there was this little bit of tension in there that it was potentially could have become a state of Australia. So,
well, it's an extraordinary sliding doors moment. Although you say 30% were in favour of it in Australia, I'm assuming, 70%, maybe some were undecided, but quite a few were opposed. So,
yeah, that's true. But it's still quite amazing.
It's very interesting. This New Deal for Papua and New Guinea, because of course they were treated separately, it was the Labor's External Territories Minister at the time was Eddie Ward, that firebrand Eddie Ward. It's interesting, he is quoted as saying that this New Deal would curb the exploitation of Indigenous labour on European-owned plantations, which of course is a great concern about to give the native an opportunity to advance in his own right and not merely to be an instrument for employment by non-native agriculturalists or industrialists. So that sense that there had been exploitation and we would be standing against that was very important in this new deal.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So this is, again, there's a changing attitude within colonial circles as well, as much as anything else. So this is the same languages coming out in Britain. They have the Colonial and Colonial Welfare Act in 1940 that has a very similar language in it. So there's an embarrassment to being a colonizer by this point. And Eddie Ward, of course, he's attracted to the idea of anything that is anti the traditional tropical sort of plantations with indentured labour. And so, his motivation is very much thinking about Papua New Guinean people as working people, and they're going to be exploited by these wealthy plantation owners, which is not necessarily the case. I don't think too many plantation owners were making a load of money up there, by the way. But that's his motivation. And now he was pretty much being manipulated by these academics in the army unit that the directorate, they had their aims, which were far more liberal internationalist in that sense, and Fabian maybe. Whereas Eddie Ward had lots of issues going on in Australia at the time, royal commissions and whatnot. And so his eye was only half on the ball on that issue. So, I wouldn't take too much notice. Although the language is, it's a very important statement that he makes.
So Ward is, as you say, he makes his statement. It's important, but his focus isn't entirely on Papua New Guinea. But the person who is very focused, of course, is Paul Haslock, who's, as you said, advising Doc Evatt, Labor's External Affairs Minister, on this issue and on the discussions at the United Nations, which, of course, is absolutely in its infancy. So Haslock, of course, becomes a Liberal politician. Yes. I think, is he a 49er? I feel like he is a 49er.
So he is a 49er.
The Liberal Party for the first time wins an election.
And he was furious he wasn't a minister straight away. Furious. Absolutely furious.
Well, he got there in the end, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
So it's interesting that Haslock is advising Evatt on Papua New Guinea and then, of course, becomes an MP in the Menzies government and subsequently he's a minister in the Menzies government responsible for Papua New Guinea as a territories minister. Does that mean that the influence of Haslock through both the Chifley government and then into the Menzies government, does it mean that there is a lot of continuity, do you see, between Chifley and Menzies, despite their different ideological positions? And particularly at that stage, Labor and Liberal were ideologically quite far apart.
Yeah. There is definitely bipartisanship in regard to, I would say, the United Nations as well, clearly PNG. Haslock is a public servant for Evatt. So they clash regularly. Evatt is brilliant but erratic. Haslock is organised and brilliant. So they clash straight away there. And he's not his only advisor, Evatt's only advisor, but he's very important. But he can bring that with him when he becomes the minister in 1951. But we do have this period in December 49 when Menzies comes to power. Percy Spender becomes the minister for external territories as well as external affairs. And, of course, his granddaughter is Allegra Spender, who is one of the Teals. And so he's a lifelong Liberal stalwart that takes on PNG, and the planters are thrilled that they've got rid of Ward and all that lot because they are quite against the planters. And Spender goes up to, in 1950, he goes to PNG, does a tour, and he makes this massive statement, very important, well, at the time was important statement, very long, 10,000 words in Parliament. And he does provide some, I guess, reassurance to the planters that they're going to be looked after, but he still emphasises that the priority here is the peoples of Papua New Guinea themselves. They are still going to be the priority, and we must have systems in place. It's all very good to have liberalism, but you must have a strong state that provides that freedom of opportunity. And then when Haslock becomes the minister in May 1951, he looks at what Spender's said and says, I kind of agree with most of that. I also agree with Ward saying the problem here is that they are a big, huge, disorganised mess, which they were. And if there's one thing that Haslock could do is be organised. And so he just straight away comes in. Ward is the minister for 7 years up there, I think, and he goes there twice, whereas within 3 months, Haslock has been there. And Haslock doesn't just go to Port Moresby. Haslock is flying all over the place. He is everywhere and anywhere. He's this ball of energy. He's completely organised. He's also the minister in charge of the Northern Territory as well at the same time. So he becomes the minister for territories, not just external territories. So The department in Canberra is looking after both policies at the same time. And I don't know if we're going to talk, I know you've had a discussion on assimilation and so forth previously, but that same attitude of assimilation that is controversial within Australia in regards to Haslock is also a motivator for him in New Guinea as well. So
it's really interesting hearing about the passion of Haslock for
incredible.
Papua New Guinea. He's really quite taken by the cause of really developing the people and the country and helping them. But as you were saying, in terms of assimilation, it's interesting. He's trying to bring in this, I guess, set them up for success internationally. So introducing universal English language is very, very helpful if you want to communicate with Australians and other countries, but that's not necessarily the native language of the various people of Papua New Guinea.
That's an interesting point. This is really important. This English language point is that there is 800 languages in PNG. Each of these peoples, it's often been called a land of 10,000 villages. Everybody has a different language in their own little villages. They don't think of themselves as the nation. So if you bind people together with a language, and English is still one of the national languages there alongside Tok Pisin. And so this idea of language is not necessarily always about outward facing. It's about trying to communicate together. And also the idea of English language is a priority alongside Christianity. That was his other, to teach morals. They were the two pillars. It came at the expense of education. So Haslock instituted an education policy that was primary school level only. There was almost no high schools. So the idea that we were going to develop a independent nation, in 1960, there's almost no high schools. And now they're independent in 1975. They get a university in 1966. It rapidly changes. Now, there's a number of reasons for that, but Haslock is criticised quite heavily by academics and others for the fact that the emphasis was on primary school because his idea was universal. Let's develop the nation first, this concept of the nation. And his idea was we weren't going to be having independence in 1975. It was going to be way in the future. And it wasn't going to be like what's happening everywhere else in the world where it's, we'll give you a constitution and you be independent. We're going to, typical of Haslock, we're going to be properly planning this. We're going to have it organised. We're going to build the nation. We're going to develop. And part of that was this very important aspect of it was this, get rid of every other priority and focus on English language. Amazing.
I mean, as you say, he was very organised and systematic about the development of PNGs as a nation. This development pyramid is extraordinary.
That's me. That's not him.
That's you. Okay. Well, I'm looking at it thinking this is incredible how he's talking about property ownership. He's talking about political development of local councils and this sort of local autonomy.
Yeah.
He's wanting all of this in the end to end up one day, obviously decades on, not just in 1975.
That's correct. So this idea came to me when I was in PNG with my wife. We did a cruise. So if you want to do PNG and you're worried about heat or security or whatever, do a cruise. The cruises are great. Anyway, we were sitting there and I wasn't going to do any work, but I thought I'll just read Haslock's fantastic autobiography of his time as minister. And I'm reading away and I read this page 195 because it etched in my mind. Oh my God, this is his plan. And I pictured it as that Maslow hierarchy of need thing, that's. And so the idea here is that at the very base is that you've got to have a physiological security. So as a government moving, and he is very evolutionary in his thinking, like step by step, we're going to evolve these people, which is problematic, but that's how he definitely was thinking. It's how his language was. And so the idea is that initially we need to pacify the natives. So we're going to pacify them. We're going to have friendly relations. We're going to establish law and order. So that's what the KIAPs, the patrol officers, did. They would go out to these territories and they would introduce themselves and then they would develop relations and eventually control them, I suppose, is one for a better word. And then they would bring in, the missionaries would come in and you would get health services and some semblance of language and schooling. And so that's at the very, very basic level. And that's, I guess, a form of social welfare. You get village courts, you get medical services. And then the next stage is step 2 is where you start thinking about agricultural improvements, developing a sense of community, bigger than like a hamlet or a village, and this idea of English language. And the idea here is that we are going to try as much as possible. Now, Haslock is criticised for trying, he's very insular in his thinking in terms of he doesn't want to be like other colonial powers. He's just disgusted by it. And at times it's a problem because he has to keep reinventing a wheel that's already been reinvented.
It's interesting, Brad, though. I understand he might have been critical of other colonial powers and ways of doing things and ways of running colonies.
Yeah.
But as I understand, he never visited another colony.
No.
The only colony he was visiting was Papua New
Yeah.
Guinea.
Yeah.
And, of course, there would have been buckets of experiences to be had and lessons to be learned, whether good ones or bad ones, from dismantling of the British Empire and all those colonies. But he wasn't interested. He wasn't going to do it. Read the reports and thought, no, I'll have none of that.
I know better. I know better.
Yeah,
I think so. He's very confident. He's a very capable person, of course. So in this stage too, though, what we get is a very important aspect is that he does know, and he's critical of the fact that economic policies in other colonies really focuses on developing factories and all that type of thing where people would move to the cities. And then you get this landless proletariat, and which creates that tension. And he doesn't want that. What we want to do is we want to develop an economic model where people stay in their villages. We don't want them coming to Port Moresby, for example. We want them to stay there. So the economic model, the agriculture, is going to be based on agriculture. We're going to have cooperatives and we're going to have plantations run by the local villagers. And the model is that these patrol officers and the agriculture officers will come in and teach new ways of growing crops, maybe rice or copra and various other coffee, for example. And Australian government would market that internationally for you. So, but the point is that people...
A lot of what you're talking about sounds incredibly paternalistic, very much sort of the state control, and we're going to make you focus on your local village and developing agricultural economy within that small village that's sort of very subsistence sounding. And Paul Haslock was a member of a government that was charting a very different economic model in Australia, and a different form of development in Australia, where we were moving people from the land to big suburban centres, big cities. We were industrialising, we were manufacturing, we were encouraging private enterprise. So it's interesting that he was adopting a model that his government at home was not at all in favour of. In fact, a lot of the policies were complete opposition to what he was promoting in Papua New Guinea. And you wonder, I mean, what was Menzies thinking about all this? Was he saying, well, not sure if these sorts of policies marry up with our philosophical positions?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think from my reading, Menzies was fully on board with what Haslock was doing in PNG. Haslock was like this inspector general of this separate world. And it's to Haslock's credit that he wasn't being influenced by what was going on elsewhere. He was focused on the problems in PNG and his version of how to fix those based on the history of past colonial problems. So, and he has his advisors, of course, but the idea here is let's keep these people, it's a form of assimilation as well. Like it is that form of, we're going to provide you with some Western stuff and we're going to bring you along slowly, but the last thing we want you to do is all move out of your home, out of your social structures that are there. That means it's much easier to maintain a country, control it. It's much easier to economically develop if you've got your hands on stuff. Because, as you say, there's no trust in the capacity of the Papua New Guinean themselves, let alone the fact that, of course, they've been providing for themselves for millennia. But this is looking down on these people, but in a generous way, I suppose.
How much do you think these ideas were informed by Haslock's liberalism?
Yeah, so I think Haslock, he's not conservative. He appears to be conservative in his mannerisms, but today's version of liberalism is different to the liberalism of Menzies' period. I mean, I'm talking to the converted. I understand that in that sense, but he is quite progressive in his thinking here. The idea is the rights of individuals is paramount, but also the role of government in providing the ability for people to be able to freely go about their business is also important. Now, here in Australia at that time, the form of liberalism, there's still a very strong government activity in the 1950s. This is not neoliberalism of the 1980s going on here. So what's going on in PNG is just a much firmer version of that because of that lack of trust and that sense of responsibility to provide the skill set to these people so they can benefit from classical liberalism in that sense. One argument is to say it stems from the 1930s, from the Great Depression, when government started, especially with the New Deal with Roosevelt, this idea of government they have a responsibility to provide safety and security, but not get in the way of individuals. Now, obviously, there's a tension there. And in this case, it's like an extreme centre of liberalism. So you've got, if you look at the spectrum of politics, you've got Fabianism, you've got Marxism, and you've got Fabianism on the left, and then you're moving towards maybe classical liberalism is more to the right. And in the middle here, we've got this playground of literally liberal internationalism, of rights of individuals is paramount, but there has to be a system put in place which provides security. Look what the world's gone through from 1914 through to...
And considering the context, you can understand those sentiments. Tell me, Brad, do you think Haslock was successful with his plan and his development pyramid as you have created?
Yeah. When I went into this research, it's really, it's pretty traditional to go into doing anything on post-colonial studies just to be critical of the colonizer. And it's pretty easy to be because it's pretty abhorrent to be in control of another group of people.
You also have the smugness of 2024 knowledge too, don't you?
I know, that's
you're
right.
You're all knowing, you're all powerful.
That's right.
And you're all right.
If I'd been there,
yes, of course, you would have done it so much better.
Oh, yeah. Nowhere near the capacity of that man.
Yeah.
I think if you look at PNG today, has it got problems? Yes. Has it had a coup? No. Has it got a thriving democracy? Yes, it's definitely got a thriving. They are so politically active there. They've definitely got their problems. And then the way the Australian government established the regime that's in place today, you could argue that it was too bureaucratic, too expensive for what they could afford. But there's so many complexities here in regard to PNG, and just think about the resources that they've got available. And they've got this thing called the Wontok, which is like responsibility back to your local people that is so strong that there's so much above nationalism there that undercuts anything that Haslock and the Australian government were doing. So the systems go there, it's functioning. We see the riots. Of course, we had the landslide, and there's definitely issues, but it is functioning. And Haslock said repeatedly on a number of times, the Australian objective needed to be that we have a safe, secure, stable northern neighbour. The last thing we want is a dysfunctional. And I was just reading in preparation for this, I was just reading the DFAT papers just to see what are their motivations. Almost the same language. Almost exactly the same language. So what last thing we want is a big basket case above us.
Well, Brad, it's the reason for a lot of Australia's aid policy in the Pacific is we want a peaceful neighbourhood, and we're going to have a peaceful neighbourhood if we have functioning democracies in our neighbourhood, if we have people who can attain good levels of human development, if they're economically prosperous. These are all very important for a peaceful neighbourhood. So as good neighbours, we help support that through our aid program.
Yeah.
Tell me, Brad, about 1975, because this happened a lot quicker than Haslock had foreseen. And I did find it interesting reading this quote by then Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam on PNG's independence. He said it was more about Australia and Australia's view of her own proper role in the world, which I thought was... I don't know. I mean, it was out of context, this quote. I haven't seen the rest of the speech, but it did sound like there wasn't much consideration for the views of the Papua New Guinea people in this Declaration of Independence, that it was something that Gough Whitlam's government was imposing on Papua New Guinea, perhaps before it was ready. What are your views on this?
Firstly, Whitlam's an interesting character in all this. So, as I said before, it's bipartisan, the policies, until the mid-1960s. Haslock has gone to become Defence Minister and then Foreign Minister and then Governor General at the end of 1963. And what we get is increasing pressure on Australia internationally, like the United Nations. We've got this trusteeship council that is monitoring Australia, and increasingly all these new colonies becoming nations. They're critical of Australia maintaining control. So it's an embarrassment to Australia to continue to be a colonial power. And so we want to wash our hands of it. That is Australia literally from the 1965 when under Barnes, and Whitlam he becomes the opposition leader in 66, and he uses an arguing point. He says, this is embarrassing. As soon as we get to power, we're going to get rid of them. This is terrible, tokenistic, white man type thing. But it's way more complicated than that. There is an element of Papua New Guineans in the Highlands, but the Highlands is only colonised in the 1930s. And so they don't know what the heck's going on. The last thing they want to do is be dominated by the coastal people. So they want to maintain their independence. There's an independence movement, a movement to stay within Australia called Papua Basina under a very dynamic female leader, Josephine Abijah, in the 1970s. So what Whitlam is saying, you are right, is only focusing on his needs, his political needs, the embarrassment of us internationally being a colonizer, whereas in PNG, it's a very slow and complicated, it's fast in one sense, but it's complicated because they've got to get buy-in from right around the country. Their constitution is built by going right around the country for 3 years to build this incredible constitution to get as much buy-in from all the different areas as possible. So it's a beautiful thing, but it's not them trying to cleave their way away from Australia. Australia wants to let them go as much as anything. There's a portion of the Papua New Guinea people that want to remain Australian. These are Australian citizens. Yes. Papuans are Australian citizens. They are letting that go. So this is what I said before about this seventh state argument. There are people there that want to be Australian, even if they're not allowed in Australia, because they weren't allowed in Australia. So they had to have they couldn't just fly down.
Despite being Australian citizens. Look,
Correct.
Brad, this is a fascinating story. And of course, from 1975, there is even more important history to discuss, which we don't have time for today. But thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light and talking about this. And fantastic, you've got this publication coming out, Preparing a Nation, which we will be very much looking forward to. And we'll put the details in the show notes. And of course, your special edition of Australian Historical Studies on this. And no doubt you will be very busy next year with the 50th anniversary celebrations.
Yes, correct.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgina. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.